In this video, we're going to cover Washington as president and talk a little bit about his first administration. So we know Washington takes office. He's elected February 4th of 1789, and he's going to take the oath of office April 30th of 1789 in New York, and will become the first president of the United States. He had many admirers. They said he was very, very smart, so he's known for his intellect. He's respected for it. He has good judgment. He uses integrity when he makes decisions. He was also known as charming, a very dignified man, but he was also very persuasive. So when he wanted to convince others to adopt his ideas, he was able to do so. Washington's presidency of the Philadelphia Convention, also known as the Constitutional Convention, will associate him closely with this new Constitution. And the people throughout the country are going to assume that he's going to be the first president of the United States. We'll talk a little bit about a little bit of conspiracy theory in class with Adams, and we'll watch a little clip. I want to show that to you to kind of illustrate the point that I'm trying to make, that sometimes the victors write history, and there are some little stories that are important enough for us to note. So people throughout the country assume that Washington will be our first president, and that the Constitution stipulated that the Electoral College members would vote for two candidates. Washington received the highest possible number of electoral votes of 69, which means he was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. And John Adams is going to be second place with 34. And at the time, the one with the most votes got president. The one with the second number of highest votes got vice president. Sometimes that worked out great when the highest number of vote getter and the second place were from two different political parties. We had a little bit of conflict there. Adams is going to be Washington's vice president, according to the Constitution of the time. We'll talk about a constitutional amendment that changes that in a little bit later. Washington was already a wealthy man. He initially is going to refuse a salary for his presidential duties, claiming that he only wants to serve the country. He's not expecting to be paid for it. But Congress is going to convince him to take the $25,000 yearly salary. That's equated to about several $100,000 today, in order to avoid this perception that an individual needs to be independently wealthy to serve as president. And so he goes ahead and takes the salary. So how did Washington view slavery? So what were Washington's views? Well, we know that George Washington kept slaves on his Virginia plantation called Mount Vernon, and he had inherited 10 slaves from his father. He acquired another 20 by marrying his wife, Martha Dandridge, and he purchased more as he grew older. He also bought some of his slaves to work for him as president, but ironically or interestingly enough, Pennsylvania, where he's going to sit as president, had enacted a law that prevents non-residents from holding slaves in the state for more than 6 months at a time. So Washington is going to have to rotate his slaves back to his Virginia plantation every 6 months in order to stay legal in the state of Pennsylvania. And some northern states are going to start passing laws that phase out slavery. The federal government as a whole is going to remain supportive of it. And in 1793, Congress passes the first Fugitive Slave Act. We'll talk about another Fugitive Slave Act that comes around in 1850 that will kind of change the game, so to speak. This Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 is going to make it a crime to help slaves or to harbor an escaped slave, and it's going to allow slave catchers to operate anywhere in the country. Washington signs this bill into law. Washington's attitude towards slavery is going to kind of shift as he continues in his political career, and although he becomes increasingly troubled by this institution of slavery, he's not going to fight publicly against it. He's not going to free his slaves during his lifetime. But in his will, he will stipulate that his slaves will be freed as soon as his wife Martha has passed away. So what were Washington's political philosophy? What were his early actions? Well, Washington viewed the main functions of the presidency as administrating the laws passed by Congress and facilitating relations between the United States and other nations. So he said, that's my job. He also is going to strongly support the separation of the three branches of government. So we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. And he does not feel that it's his role to intervene or to influence the work of Congress. That's Congress. That's a completely different branch from me. They operate separate from me. So early in his presidency, he's going to sign bills taxing imports and establishing executive departments, such as the Department of State, Department of War, and the Department of the Treasury. Washington is responsible for creating these executive departments that we still operate with today. Today we have 15. Washington created 3 of those. Washington also appoints the heads of these departments. The head of the Department of State is called the Secretary of State. So the head of each department is called the Secretary. And the secretaries, the head of each department, make up the president's cabinet. So the members that he works very closely with, and he speaks with frequently. So these leaders during Washington's administration are going to be Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and he's going to appoint John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Washington is going to favor a relatively strong role for the federal government. So if you were going to classify him as a political party, which he was not, you would probably classify him as a Federalist because he supports strong federal government. This is in direct contrast to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson supports a more limited federal government with stronger state power. And these differences that we're going to discuss later are going to contribute to the first division in government into those opposing political parties. And those opposing political parties we're going to build our project out of. So regarding foreign policy, Washington believes very, very strongly that the United States should remain neutral in the affairs of other countries. That means that we don't interfere with and we don't mess with what they're doing. This is going to prove very difficult to live up to, as Great Britain and France are going to be constantly at war with each other and continuously trying to draw the United States into their conflicts. The United States is going to attempt to remain neutral, but it's going to prove extremely difficult for them to actually accomplish. So, what were some of these foreign challenges that Washington is going to have to deal with and address during his presidency? Well, for one, our relationship with Britain is going to remain pretty cold. If you remember back, we just beat the British during the American Revolution, so they're not just willing to turn around and shake hands and become friends with us immediately. We'll eventually get there. By World War I, we're allies, World War II, but prior to that, we don't have a really strong relationship with Britain. So the British are going to impose high tariffs. Remember, tariffs are taxes on imports on American goods, and this is going to make it very, very difficult for American farmers and manufacturers to sell their products to the British. That was a big market for us prior to the American Revolution, and that changes after the American Revolution into this new nation. At the same time, Britain is going to send large volumes of goods to the U.S., which creates a significant trade imbalance. So we're buying a lot of their goods, but they're not buying many of our goods. And this is going to hurt American production. British naval vessels are also going to routinely seize American ships carrying military supplies to Britain's enemies, particularly France. And the U.S. is going to resent Britain's refusal to withdraw several military forts that it had agreed to vacate after the American Revolution. These forts are located in the West, also the Northwest Territory. I'll give you a hint. In 1812, when we start another war with Britain, they're still going to be there. The British haven't gone anywhere. Despite these difficulties, Washington chooses not to support France in its war against Britain. And this is going to anger the French government, who is going to try to rally the Americans to its side. If you remember, during the war of the American Revolution, the British give us not only monetary support, but they also give us men and ships and help us beat Britain. Also because it was beneficial to them. So in 1794, Washington sends Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate with the British. And there, Jay's going to work out a highly controversial treaty between the two countries. This treaty, known as Jay's Treaty, gained little for the United States. It actually granted certain additional concessions to Britain. And for example, the British are going to agree to vacate these forts, which they had already promised to leave in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and they had not. And while Jay allows Britain to seize supplies for American ships on their way to France, as long as Britain agrees to pay for the supplies, the treaty set off protests and is going to stoke anger about these British practices of seizing American ships in the Atlantic Ocean. But despite these challenges in foreign relations, Washington is going to remain a proponent of neutrality throughout his 2 terms of presidency. In his farewell address in 1794, he called for the United States to focus on domestic issues and refrain from siding with other countries. And although he strongly supported international trade, he is going to become a proponent of neutrality. As we've already talked about in class, Washington's administration kind of gives birth to political parties. Even though he was adamantly opposed to them, he's going to see them created during his administration, and even worse, among his cabinet members. We know that Washington opposed the idea of political parties, and he isn't going to identify with one particular party. Although we know that if he would have identified with a party, he probably would have been a Federalist. But divisions within his administration are going to lead to the creation of the first political parties in our new nation. And these parties are going to develop mainly in response to disagreements over how strong a role the federal government should play. One of the central issues is the controversy over the first bank. And in 1791, Alexander Hamilton succeeded in getting Congress to pass a bill establishing this first bank of the United States. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Attorney General Edmund Randolph very strongly feel that the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the right to do this. And because the Constitution doesn't specifically mention this power, Hamilton, on the other hand, feels like the Constitution does grant the government broad powers, and unless it specifically denies the power to the federal government, then the federal government should have that power. This becomes known as a very loose constructionist point of view of the Constitution, whereas Jefferson's is going to be a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Washington, on this idea, is going to side with Hamilton, and he's going to sign this bill into law, creating the first national bank of the United States. The disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson is just going to escalate from there, and people on both sides of the argument are going to begin to identify themselves either as Federalists, which were led by Hamilton, or Democratic Republicans, Anti-Federalists first, and then later Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. In general, Federalists were usually Northerners. They were industrialists, and these Democratic Republicans are more likely to be Southern agriculturalists. George Washington is going to continue to state his opposition to political parties and try to get Hamilton and Jefferson to kind of come to an agreement. But nevertheless, their disagreement is going to lead to the first political parties in the United States, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. These Democratic Republicans are commonly referred to and refer to themselves as simply Republicans. In the election of 1792, is going to involve debates around party lines, with the primary disagreement being on how strong should the federal government be. How strong does the Constitution allow the federal government to be? And this debate is going to play out mainly at the state level, with congressional candidates taking sides. Washington's elected president for the second term in 1792 without ever officially siding with a party. The Whiskey Rebellion, during Washington's first term, a popular rebellion is going to arise in response to attacks on manufacturing of whiskey. This was part of Hamilton's economic plan. In 1791, he had convinced Congress to pass this tax to help pay off some of the country's war debt, as well as establishing the federal government's authority. And as President would tell us, when we disagreed with something in the United States or in America, what did we do? We rebelled. And so when these farmers, who typically convert their extra grain into whiskey, oppose this tax, they're going to do so, and their opposition to it is going to naturally lead to, we'll just rebel against it. And that's what they do. In Western Pennsylvania, they refuse to pay the tax. They stage attacks against federal officials. And Washington, in this situation, is going to take the lead here and do something that I feel is very, very significant. Washington is going to send 13,000 troops to put down this rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. Would it have taken 13,000 troops to put down small farmers in Western Pennsylvania? Probably not. But Washington himself is going to lead these 13,000 men into battle, potentially, in Western Pennsylvania. History tells us that when he gets there, the farmers disperse, they've gone home, and it ends the rebellion. But Washington's strong response in this situation, that if you rebel in this government under this constitution, this is the response you're going to get. We're not going to rewrite a constitution. We're not going to change laws. We're not going to bend and bow to these rebellions. We're going to simply put them down. Becomes a very strong statement and solidifies the power of the federal government in this situation. So again, if you can imagine it, imagine Donald Trump leading our troops into battle today. And that kind of seems like a crazy idea to us because it's so far from what we think of. But again, Washington, the only president we've ever had to lead troops into battle as sitting president, he does this and he makes a strong statement. We don't see a lot of rebellions happen after this, thanks to his strong response in this situation. So this assertion of authority of the federal government to use military force against citizens sends the message that this government isn't going to tolerate violent uprisings and that citizens who want to change the law are going to have to do so through legal means, through peaceful means. This suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion is going to encourage many farmers and rural residents to turn against the Federalists and to lend stronger support to these Democratic Republicans. So it increases the support for the Democratic Republicans in the United States, especially in those territories where there's a lot of farmers. Washington, the Constitution doesn't set term limits for the president, but Washington is going to choose to end his presidency after the second term. And in his farewell address, he's going to call for a unified federal government, free from the divisiveness of political parties, a public sense of religious and moral obligation, and stable and balanced public coffers. Significantly, he's also going to warn against an overly powerful military and permanent alliances with foreign countries. John Adams, a Massachusetts lawyer, delegate to the Constitutional Convention, Washington's vice president, will win the election in 1796. He's going to run as a Federalist against Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr on the Democratic Republican side, and he narrowly wins. He's going to gain most of New England's electoral votes, and Adams, who had been a strong supporter of independence from Great Britain and a leader in Congress's adoption of the Declaration of Independence, was known as an emotional man with a blunt and impatient demeanor and with a certain degree of vanity. Traits that many people are going to find disagreeable. And those close to him, however, knew him as kind and affectionate, but he's seen as socially awkward. He's not as likable as Jefferson is. He's not as likable as Washington was. And therefore, he will be a one-term president. Adams is opposed to slavery. He doesn't own slaves, but he will not speak out against the institution or work for it to end. And he hopes to keep this highly controversial issue out of the realm of major political debate while he is president. All right, we're going to have some discussion questions. If you will work on answering these, bring these with you to class on Monday. If you have any questions about them, we will go over them. But here they are. What did George Washington see as the president's role in the federal government? What was Washington's position on foreign relations, and was this a realistic policy, and why? What were the main points of disagreement between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or you could substitute Federalists and the Democratic Republicans? And what did the federal government's response to the Whiskey Rebellion demonstrate? If you'll answer those in your notes, bring those with you to class on Monday. Have a great weekend. I'll see you then.